How would you feel if your doctor told you that you had 6 months to keep working the way you've been working, or you'd be bedridden or worse? Well, that's exactly where Shauna Nuckles found herself after years of rising the ranks among PR agencies, initially making a pivot into agency life from journalism and then running her own PR firm. It was after all that success that Shauna found herself facing a very stark reality, coming to terms with her own personal burnout. In this conversation with Shauna, who is now the founder of Advocation, a consultancy helping agencies avoid employee burnout and implement operational systems for a healthier work environment, we talk about how Shauna managed to deal with that pivotal moment, how you can recognize if you're headed for a similar situation, where we discuss talking with your team about burnout in a way that balances candor with a sense of stability. We even get into some very practical tips, like how agency owners should write and update their own job descriptions. With that, let's hear from Shauna as she takes us back to a pivotal moment in her agency life.
I was working at a pace that was, in retrospect, completely unsustainable, probably putting in 12 to 16 hour days every day for months on end. And in all transparency, honesty, I probably would have kept doing that if my body didn't very overtly say, hey, there's something wrong with this. You've got to pay attention. So I was only able truly to sleep from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. every day for probably 6 months in a row. And then in 3 months, all of a sudden, I'd gained 40 pounds. So I went to my doctor because I knew that wasn't normal. And in all honesty, I don't think I would have if I didn't have those body signals to tell me that something was not right. And really what my doctor told me was, you're right. This isn't good. This isn't, something that your body can really sustain. And getting that ultimatum essentially where they said, hey, listen, you're going to crash and burn and be bedridden in 6 months if you keep working at this pace, or you can get a new career. And I didn't like either of those options. So I really pulled apart how to work differently. And that's essentially the journey I have been on for the last several years and was the catalyst to what we're doing inside of Advocation today.
So I've heard people talk about the different stages of grief, and I'm no psychologist, so I don't even think I can necessarily name them. But you mentioned, as you heard that news, you're like, I don't like either of those. Was it a little bit of anger digging in your heels? Was it doesn't seem like it was necessarily surprise because you had some of those signals, but what would you say was the first emotion or stage you were in after it was, here are the two options?
I would say, honestly, it was shame. My initial reaction was, what did I do wrong to get to this place? And almost the immediate reaction was, I need to hide this and solve this on my own, because at the end of the day, a lot of what got me to where I was that mentality of, I need to truck on, I need to keep up with this pace of work, I'm not doing enough at the end of the day. And that was my immediate reaction. And I think that's really common in burnout experiences where you lean harder into what's not working as your first reaction instead of trying to do something differently. And that was true for me at the very beginning.
I appreciate, as you said earlier, just the candor and the openness here. And I think that has led to a lot of the content that you've shared and the work that you've done for other agencies. I think what you just said there is a nice segue into, why did this happen? You mentioned, I felt shame about, how did I get here? Why did this happen? Why did I make these choices? So what do you think are some of those contributing factors, both internal and maybe external, that other agency leaders, you had come up in journalism, made a pivot into PR. You had at that point been an individual contributor and run your own agency. So thinking about that path, what were maybe some of those internal and external factors that contributed to the why of this before we get into the how do you start addressing it, and,
Yeah.
and what can we learn from that as we go forward for other folks who maybe are experiencing the same thing?
I built my career at the very beginning through the Great Recession. So there was a lot of, scarcity mentality in myself. And what my career looked like during that time was 2 jobs and a side hustle to pay rent, truly. And so there was that element. I need to push, I need to hustle, I need to make enough money to pay my bills. And that work ethic paid off. And I got to a certain point in my career where it looked like I'd quote unquote made it to the outside world. I'd risen through the ranks and was serving as number 2 inside of an agency, great clients, team under me. And that concept of that level of pushing never turned off. And so I think that was a big part of it. This mentality of I've got to do more, I've got to push harder, and never really questioning that inside of myself. And then to answer the other part of your question there of, what are some external factors? This is what I've been unpacking long term and really kind of sits at the foundation of what we use as our methodology inside of a company. And we see this now day in, day out with the agency teams we're working with. And it's really a lack of business stability that contributes to burnout for agency owners, executives, team members, interns, all the way through the ranks. And really thinking about what is it that you need in place as your business foundation to build on top of it in a way that is sustainable and contributes to prosperity for you financially, for your team, and across the board.
I've heard you tell not only this story of, the moment of truth that you had to face with the doctor where you felt that initial shame, but then also, as you and I have talked about on why this is common or uncommon, especially in the agency space and those doing creative work. I want to come back to that on something that you just mentioned. But before then, tell me a little bit about where you started to really realize how common this was among agencies, both owners and the folks on the front lines. Where did that come about? Where did that realization happen as you started to talk about this more publicly?
Yeah, so I healed privately, if that's the right word, in my burnout, where I threw spaghetti at the wall, had a lot of hard conversations, tested, learned, and tried to figure out what was really going to work for me to find a different way to work. And I spent several years doing that behind the scenes privately with myself and, my personal professional relationships. And then I got to a point where I was ready to share that story publicly for the first time. And truly, it was something I needed to do for myself to share, what I'd learned and give back to the industry. And I really thought I might get my mom texting me afterwards, like, nice story, honey, that was so brave or whatever. And what happened was the complete opposite and shocking and humbling for me. I received dozens of private messages from people I knew, my past colleagues, clients that I had worked with, and as well as professionals across the entire globe from various continents telling me, I've experienced burnout and it caused an immune disease in my body. I've experienced burnout and fainted at client events. I've gone to the hospital with heart palpitations and the doctor told me it was stress related from work. And so really seeing the people that I knew and what they were struggling with privately, people just coming out of the woodworks and had no relation to me and somehow found my story from it being shared, really indicated to me that this is something that is an industry-wide and probably worldwide epidemic that we need to talk about in order to fix.
You can hear stats of, stress levels are on the rise and those sorts of things. And there's been a lot of data coming out about mental health with children post-pandemic and what did we handle well and not and all those sorts of things. But those individual stories are tougher to ignore, which is why, I appreciate your candor in talking about this. Going back to something you said earlier, there are all of these stories of folks, and you mentioned a little bit about an underlying external factor, but I think we would be remiss not to address why is it so common, especially in the agency space, to where some people say agency life, which is the name of the show, is somewhat synonymous with burnout and bad work-life balance and those sorts of things. You mentioned maybe business stability. I've heard some people say, some agency owners, they're very creative. They don't quite have the operational mindset, and they get into the business and they kind of have that same founder's problem. What are some of the things there, either in the persona of an agency owner, that aren't necessarily good or bad, but something that they have to learn to handle so that they don't burn themselves out or their teams? What are some of those common factors you think that we should have our eyes open to, especially as you've heard more conversations of people fainting and passing out and going to the doctor like you did?
We get the opportunity to, so to speak, look under the hood of dozens of agencies at any given time with the work that we do. And so we've really been able to quantify what exactly are the common business challenges that cause teams to feel burnout or that chaos and internal friction. And so there are a number of really common, to use that phrase again, stabilization issues that we see in agencies that are kind of the culprits of this. And one really common one is unprofitable scopes of work. And when we say business foundations, that is one that contributes to burnout, I would say, more than anything else, because what happens is something's got to give. If you're putting out a scope of work that's not clear, profitable, and your business and team can thrive within, people end up working for free. And usually it is the owner who's trying to fill in all of those gaps, or perhaps their team is being stretched and having to put in extra hours that a client maybe isn't paying for because they got that scope of work wrong. So that's one of the most common, very practical things that we see inside of a company. And then when it comes to founder, owner, CEO personalities and profiles, I think understanding your blind spots and what that really looks like through the evolution and scaling of an agency and company, that scrappy, I can rub two pennies together and make $10 attitude works incredibly well at the startup phase. But then you get to a certain point where you really do need business basics set up and prioritized, and founders kind of get stretched outside of what their skill set is. A lot of times we see start their businesses because they're subject matter experts and they're not experts in running a business. And that's okay. Lean into what you're good at and start to hire a team who can build the right systems and processes around you. But it does mean that you're going to have to start doing business a little bit differently once you get to a certain size.
I love that you called that out, that distinction and that balance between being great at the craft. And what often comes with that with agency founders is that visionary mentality, the ability to see, hey, if we did this, there's opportunity over here. If we launch this service line, and I think on future episodes, we'll talk a little bit about where the framework of EOS, the entrepreneurial operating system, and recognizing where you need the visionary skill sets and the integrator skill sets, as they talk about there. But we won't go off on a rabbit trail there. I do want to double click on what you talked about in blind spots. So I think one of those is, like you said, being great at the craft, being great at being able to craft a vision, be scrappy, but not necessarily have some of those core business foundational competencies. But a few of the other blind spots I know you've called out and you've noticed in your own journey were a scarcity mentality and a bent towards perfectionism. Where do you see that coming up with other agency owners, and how do you recommend they keep an eye out for those and try to mitigate the negative impacts of them?
We really see both of those put gasoline on the fire of burnout, because they really put founders and employees into an amplified mindset of burnout. And it's really easy to focus on the wrong things when you're in scarcity mentality or perfectionism. So
what does that usually look like, focusing on the wrong things?
So for perfectionism, I'll speak to that as an example because I call myself a recovering perfectionist. Really, you tend to be very self-focused and get tunnel vision on what's right in front of you, and it really sets you up to be in this mentality of struggling to kind of see the forest from the trees. We see commonly with founders is, they're hyper focused on getting things 100% right versus good enough to ship, and kind of evolving and iterating on services, building their team, and it causes them to be stagnant, but also really slow down their growth and potential as a company. And one really specific and very common place where we see this play out specifically in owners is delegating to other team members. And it's not even necessarily that mentality of I'm the founder, no one can do it as good as me. It's this fear that we'll lose clients if this isn't perfect when it's shipped out to the client, versus your team usually can get it 80% of the way there, and maybe you can polish it and send it off. But we see founders and owners hold on to things way too long because there's this fear and perfectionism kind of wrapped up in handing things off to their team.
And I think that goes hand in hand, the perfectionism and the scarcity mindset, because like you said, there are times in the business, there are times based on the economic situation that you do have to work harder, and there are real concerns of, are we going to make it through this, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that awareness is the first step to having those conversations about, okay, I'm going to delegate this, but here's kind of what I'm scared of. You mentioned earlier having hard conversations. Some of those I'm imagining are with your team. If you are an agency leader or founder, where do you think that idea of the candid conversations comes in if you realize that perfectionism and the scarcity mindset are affecting you negatively, especially as the agency owner?
This concept of radical candor it's a fabulous book for anyone who's not read the book. It's this concept of having tough, challenging conversations in a constructive and meaningful way. And some of the really challenging conversations that we see necessary for agency owners in having is being honest and transparent about the current state of their company, instead of trying to pretend like everything is perfect, we're all A players, we're crushing it. And just that vulnerability and humbleness as a founder to say to your team, hey, everyone, I know that it's chaotic inside of the company right now. Here's what I'm striving to do to fix it. Here's where I can use some of your help. And here's where some of our unknowns are. And I think that is really challenging for owners to have a conversation like that, because one, you don't want to freak your team out. So it's important that you have it in a way where you're able to stand in some strength, but being able to be honest in where you're struggling really creates that level of transparency. It's really needed to have strong and stable teams.
I am a big fan of that book, Radical Candor by Kim Scott. We'll make sure we link to that in the show notes of this episode. Basically, there's 4 quadrants, I believe, right? And it's all about the 2 axes. How candid are you being? How clear, but also how kind?
Yeah.
Because there are really 3 quadrants you don't want to be in. One that you do, and that's called radical candor, where you're both balancing kindness and candor. One of the other quadrants, I believe, is called ruinous empathy, which I think a lot of agency owners can fall into. They're being kind, but they're not being candid, which is, the other side of it, I think, is called obnoxious aggression, where you're being very candid, but you're not delivering it in a kind way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a balance, but it's also that fear of like, what if I freak the team out? How do I communicate stability, but also transparency? Any examples you've seen of, agency owners balancing this well?
The one example that I'm thinking of is an agency client of ours where all of a sudden their business exploded and it really disrupted the day-to-day of client work. And they did a great job of balancing, in a group setting, kind of, here's what we need to prioritize, and let's not worry about this stuff right now. Like, yes, these are problems inside of the agency, but this is really where we need to point our attention. And then pairing that with some one-on-one conversations to dig into each team member and, hey, this is where I see you really excelling. This is where I kind of need you to step up, and providing that individual clarity. Because what can happen in a group setting, you can't share entirely blanket statements with the entire company, because then people are left wondering, how does that apply to me? So really being able to, share cohesively, but then dig in with each individual team member so they have their marching orders and they can really get to work and have some clarity on making meaningful progress in their day-to-day.
So what I hear you saying there, Shauna, is think about the group communication strategy and the message, and how do you balance transparency with still a feeling of stability, which isn't always in bad times. In this example, It was an agency that was doing really well, but that can create instability. And personally, I was part of a high growth agency, and I'm just nodding along as you said that for folks that are just listening and not watching the video. So I can totally relate. But that point of whether you lead any sort of team, there's the group message, but there's also addressing, okay, what questions is Shauna going to have, and addressing those individually, because you can't just kind of blast that out. So I think that's very tactical for folks to think about the strategy and the execution of the group communication, but both of those steps for the individual one-on-one conversations as well. The other thing I've heard you talk about before, Shauna, is the 3 different types of burnout. As we talk about more, how do we deal with this? How do we have the candid conversations? We've talked about keeping your eye out for a scarcity mentality and perfectionism. But the other thing to keep your eyes out for are the different types of burnout as you've termed them. Tell us a little bit about how you think about these and how your thinking's evolved maybe.
You're such an excellent host, because I was thinking I want to dig into this a little bit further with the 3 types of burnout. There are 3 common types of burnout. The one type of burnout that we most think of is what they call overload burnout. So that's where you're stretched way too thin. You've got a to-do list that's incredibly long, and really at the end of the day, you are trying to do way too much. But then there is neglect burnout, which is also very common inside of agencies, where you almost feel abandoned by, if you're in an employee role, you almost feel abandoned by leadership, because you are left thinking, what the heck am I supposed to do every day? You feel a little helpless and directionless. And that is another type of burnout that has different symptoms and feels a little bit differently. And then there's a third type of burnout where you feel under challenged, and you might have a reasonable workload. You might have clarity on that workload, but there's nothing about it that lights you up. There's nothing that's exciting, and your body's full of lead, essentially, and you're just moving through the day like so slowly, unmotivated. All 3 of them can happen inside of agencies. And the last 2 are often not talked about or addressed. So a lot of the conversation that we just had about communication, clarity with your team, having those one-on-one conversations so that people know what relates to them and what doesn't, that really prevents that neglect level burnout. Because when agencies get busy, which they all do, all agencies are busy, that's just the nature of the industry, people start to question what their purpose is, what they're supposed to be doing. And then it gets to a point where they feel incompetent, and it can start to lead to that third type of burnout where you're feeling incompetent, purposeless, and it can be almost just a continuous cycle where it gets tougher and tougher to get out of it. So that level of clarity can really nip that second type and third type of burnout right in the bud.
I'm glad that we went there, and I'll give you more credit than myself as the host, because I know I've heard you talk about these 3. And when I heard it first, I was like, wow, there's really something here. And I would agree with you that we talk a lot and we think a lot about that first type, which you called overload burnout, right?
Yeah.
And the neglect piece, I think, goes back to something you mentioned earlier when SOWs aren't clear, when people on the front lines aren't clear about the scope. And, you can have times where someone is experiencing the overloaded burnout, and at the same time, someone on the front lines of the agency and the owner is like, man, our profit margins are shrinking. And so they're frustrated and they're coming to the frontline employee saying, well, what are you doing with this client? Why did this take so long? And da 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 da. And they're feeling the overload. And then the agency owner is feeling the pressure of the profit margin shrinking. That can lead to not only the overload, but the neglect, because it not necessarily that they are not getting any information, but they're not getting the right information.
Yeah.
How should I respond to the client here? What's our pricing model, and how does that impact the way that I talk to the customer about billable time? Where do I see the scope of work very quickly? So when I'm put on the spot by the client saying, hey, well, why can't you do this? Well, I need to check the SOW. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That can add stress and add to those feelings of neglect. So to double down maybe on the neglect piece, because you and I have both recognized it's common, but it's not talked about as much as the first type of burnout, that is. I think what you mentioned earlier, having the one-on-one conversations, especially when things are changing, is a way that you can address that. What are some of the other tactical things you advise owners and leaders to address that sort of neglect sort of burnout?
We see these common challenges come through in a lot of the audits that we do for the agencies we work with. What we talked about in scopes up at the beginning of the conversation is definitely priority number one. But the other key areas are agencies really need clearly defined roles. And those can become really muddy inside of agencies because you're pulling in, hey, we need Sam to jump in on this project because Susan's out sick this week and we just need an extra set of hands. Or you've got a client that comes in and it's an all hands on deck type of project. And when people are not clear in what their role is, it creates that neglect burnout and the mentality of, I really don't know what my job is at the end of the day. And so I don't feel like I am doing a good job. So taking the time to define each person's role inside of a company and revisiting and revising them on an as needed basis, because companies evolve, agencies, roles change as they grow and scale. So even your role as the founder is going to be very different today than it is 18 months from now if you increase your revenue by 25% this year. So that I would say is second. And then third is you absolutely need a process and system in your day-to-day to track the progress of your projects. So you're not spinning your wheels and figuring out what is everybody's priorities this week? What's the status of this project? Who's doing what? Who's responsible for what? Did we miss this deadline? Did we make that deadline? We see a lot of agencies overspend their resources on just trying to figure out what the heck everybody is doing. And again, really contributes to that lack of clarity, lack of understanding what my job is, lack of knowing what I'm supposed to be doing every day. And if you really stabilize those three things, we see that fix probably 75% of the challenges that agencies experience in the day-to-day.
We've talked about recognizing the signs. Sometimes those are obvious with, as you mentioned in your case, they were physical signs of burnout. We've talked about recognizing the different types of burnout and some of the internal and external factors. At the end of the day, for someone listening to this, Shauna, what would you recommend as some of the first steps, whether that's trying to recognize burnout or to deal with it? What are some of the things that you would advise folks to do today as a first step? Because obviously, as you mentioned, it's prevalent and it has a lot of big impacts. And so we can feel overwhelmed with feeling overwhelmed. So a few steps to take in the right direction today for folks.
There are some really simple, practical micro movements that have worked really well for me and the individuals that I've shared with, just to start to move yourself out of that state of burnout and to prevent you from getting there again in the future. One of those is thinking beyond today and really casting a wider vision for what it is you're trying to achieve, either as a business owner or as an employee professionally in your career. Because when we aren't focused on what, our ultimate goal is, we use the term North Star inside of our company a lot. Where are we pointing our attention and what's really important? It's impossible to prioritize. So if we're trying to prioritize all of these little small micro tasks and projects in the day to day, it's really easy to get overwhelmed because we're not understanding or seeing how they ladder up to a bigger picture. So that would be step one in my recommendation. Very practically journaling about it, talking about it with a trusted colleague or family member, spouse, is a really good way to start to move yourself out of the weeds. And then some big relief can come from a couple of habits for how you're managing your time in the day-to-day. So we use this concept of time blocking, and we didn't invent it, obviously, but we find that works incredibly well for making sure you can make progress every day towards those goals. In the agency environment, it's really easy for all of our time to get taken up by Slack and emails and meetings. And it's imperative to set boundaries around those things that can eat up your time so that you can think, so that you can do strategy, so that you can execute on high priority projects. And it's easy to do that as the founder because you control your own schedule, but empowering your team and saying, hey, it's okay if you check client emails at 9, noon, and 5 so that you can work in between those sections. Or we've seen a lot of agencies employ no meeting Fridays so that you can be heads down focused and get that work done. So employees can really only do so much in that arena, but as a founder, you can help your team set those time boundaries to protect their bandwidth.
I love that. I was part of an agency that we did no meeting Tuesday mornings, right? Because it's one thing to time block. It's tough when you're time blocking and making time for deep work and thinking, which contributes to the first action item you mentioned. Make time for thinking, casting the vision, getting out of the day-to-day, as they say in EOS, time to work on the business, not just in the business. It's tough to do that when everybody else is running around and trying to catch up on email and responding to Slack and pinging you. Even if you turn those notifications off, it can be tough. It's kind of like when you're on vacation, but you know everybody else isn't. You've got that little bit of guilt or stress in the back of your mind. I think a way to do that is, like you said, to have time blocks that are shared across the organization to a degree, to where there's a little bit of that relief. As you said, take a deep breath and focus on some deep work because you know other folks are working on deep work as well. So very actionable stuff. As we round out the conversation today, Shauna, 2 things that we want to do that we do on every episode here of Agency Life. We want to ask you our fast 5 questions. And then we want to give you an opportunity to give someone a shout out that has impacted your journey in agency life. So you ready for the fast 5?
Yes, excited.
All right, let's go. If someone gave you $10,000 a month to help you better run your consultancy today, how would you use it?
For where we are in the business today, I would spend it on team and marketing.
I love it. What are some of your all-time favorite business books?
Dare to Lead by Brene Brown is an excellent one. Essentialism and The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. And all of those are really excellent mindset shifters too for anyone who is struggling with burnout.
I love it. I love me some Simon Sinek in little bits or in longer doses in his books. So great call out there. Number 3 of our Fast 5. What's one mistake you've made in running your agency that you will absolutely never forget?
Bringing in some wrong fit clients into the company. And there were a few instances, so I would say there may be more than one mistake, but not trusting my gut and intuition as to why that client was not a good fit.
I have been there, so I can totally relate. That is probably a topic for a whole other episode in what to do when you have those wrong fit clients. But we'll save that one for another day because it's called the Fast 5 for a reason. So number 4, what do you think is the hardest part about agency life?
For me personally, it's always been managing the different stakeholders. So I used to have a PR agency and run a PR agency. So we had clients, team, media, and they all have competing different priorities, and really balancing those is always a challenge.
I couldn't agree more. What do you think? Because we want to end this on a positive note with the Fast Five. Number five, what's the best part about agency life, in your opinion, Shauna?
I love the energy of an agency, the type of people that are attracted to that. It's why I've dedicated my career to it, and I really think you can't find it anywhere else.
I would totally agree. All right. As we do with every episode, we want to give you an opportunity to give someone a shout out that has been impactful in your journey. Who would you like to thank or mention? Maybe someone other people should follow. If it's someone who's more private, that's okay as well.
One of my most impactful business mentors, her name is Jennifer Kem, and she is a branding, business building guru expert. And she really has taught me so much about building a business based upon your values and what that really looks like in practical terms versus, just theory or, being more esoteric about it. And she is a brilliant mind, and I would highly recommend anyone go follow her.
Great recommendations. Well, Shauna, from where we started the conversation with your story, coming to terms with where you were at with burnout and walking us through some of the lessons learned, some of these stories from agency owners that you're now consulting with, I think there's been a lot for people to take away from this episode. I really appreciate it. If you're listening to this, I want to encourage you to connect with Shauna and her team at Advocation on LinkedIn. You can find her Shauna Nuckles, Nuckles. Shauna, any other parting thoughts or resources you want to share with folks as we wrap up today?
My one parting thought is, if you're feeling or finding yourself in a state of burnout, to remember that it's not forever and that there are ways out. And even though it feels and can feel like that's not the case right now, there's support all around you in this industry. So seek out colleagues like we talked about and take it one day at a time. And there is the other side of burnout.
I love it. Well, I hope people have gotten some hope from your story, some encouragement, as much as they've gotten some tactical advice, some practical things, like those agency owners that need to go write their own job description. Go and do that, but be encouraged with Shauna's words today. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Shauna, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.